August 7th, 1977. A date that would forever change the quiet town of Laurelwood, Oregon. 4 lives snuffed out in an instant, 2 of them innocent children. But this isn't just another murder story. It's a journey into the heart of America's most notorious motorcycle club, the Hells Angels, a world where loyalty is sacred and betrayal is a death sentence. This story spans a decade, involves over 50 law enforcement officers, and culminates in a trial so dangerous that witnesses had to be smuggled into court in hollowed-out vending machines. From the streets of California to the prisons of San Quentin, from small-town detectives to hardened criminals, this tale will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, loyalty, and the thin line between right and wrong. Buckle up, because the road ahead is dark, twisting, and paved with blood. Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. On a peaceful Sunday morning in August 1977, the sleepy town of Laurelwood, Oregon, was about to be shaken to its core. Detective Sergeant Mike Graham received a call that would change his life forever. A homicide.
On a Sunday, August 7th, 1977, I received a call out regarding a homicide. I had no idea what the situation was, and it was in a small town, a small community called Laurelwood.
Multiple victims. As he drove to the scene, his mind raced with possibilities. What could have happened in this quiet community? Entering the house, Mike Graham was hit by the overwhelming smell of blood. The scene before him was like something out of a nightmare. 2 adults and 2 children, executed with precision.
When I went into the house and first observed the man and the woman in the living area, I determined that they had bullet wounds behind their left ear. We moved into the bedroom, and I discovered 2 twin girls lying side by side. Both had been shot in the back of the head, behind the left ear.
Professional hit. But why here? Why them? As he surveyed the carnage, his eyes fell on the twin girls, their lifeless hands still clutching teddy bears.
They were clutching teddy bears, both of them. They were about 5.5 or 6 years of age.
It was an image that would haunt him for years to come.
What did I feel? Well, when I looked at the little girls, my own children were about that age.
The victims were identified as Margo Compton, her twin daughters Sylvia and Sandra, and Gary Sessler.
We discovered that the woman was Margo Compton. The twin girls were Margo's daughters, Sylvia and Sandra, and the young man was Gary Sessler.
But who were they really, and what had brought this violence to their doorstep? Little did Mike Graham know he was standing at the precipice of a case that would consume the next decade of his life, testing his resolve, his relationships, and his very sanity. Chapter 2. The Angel's Shadow. As Mike Graham dug deeper into the victims' backgrounds, a sinister connection began to emerge. Margo Compton wasn't just an ordinary mother of 2.
At 15, she started dating a guy called Doug Compton. She moved in with them, and at 16, they got married and they seemed happy.
When Doug and I first got married, I didn't want anyone else because I loved him. She got pregnant, and it was during the pregnancy that he started becoming violent with her. That night, he beat me so bad, my back is still screwed up from it.
She had a past, one that was inextricably linked to one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in America, the Hells Angels.
Doug was not very fatherly, and at that time, there was an influx of Hells Angels in our town. They were there to recruit, and he started hanging around more and more with them, and less with the kids, or being there on the weekends or going on family outings. Doug was a wannabe. There's a difference between a wannabe and a prospect.
When the Hells Angels came to our town, there was a lot of drugs that weren't there before, and Doug changed dramatically because he was using drugs, never eating, never sleeping, always on the go. He started using intravenously, which caused him to be even more paranoid. He drank more, and he would hurt her. He would beat her. He would try to kill her.
Margo knew that the situation was getting out of control, and she knew he was going to kill her. But she needed help to get away from Doug because she had tried so many times before.
The name Buck Garrett kept surfacing.
It was a guy called Buck Garrett. Margo felt he was the best person to talk to about helping her. He was the only person that Doug had any respect for or cared about what he thought about him. So that's what she did. Margo didn't realize it at the time, but approaching Buck Garrett was the worst decision she ever made.
He said, "Now get your things together. The twins' clothes and some toys and whatever I wanted to take, but not to try and take anything big." He said, "You can take a man's wife, but you can't touch his TV." Buck did provide a house and the food and the utilities and everything that they needed. And had Doug come around, Buck would have protected them against him. And he also said he could help her get a job. He told me that it was an encounter studio and that it was like a counseling place, where businessmen would come, kick their feet up and relax and have someone to talk to.
A high-ranking member of the Vallejo chapter, Garrett was known for his ruthlessness and ambition.
Buck Garrett was a member of the Vallejo chapter of the Hells Angels, a well-respected Hells Angel. He wielded a lot of power. He had connections to Sonny Barger. He was also a despicable human being.
He straddled the line between old-school mafia tactics and modern drug enterprises.
He thought of himself as an old-style mafia guy. He had a ruthless side to him, a very ambitious side to him, and a very dangerous side. Everybody knew about his drug business. Everybody knew about his prostitution and everything else that he was involved in.
Margo had been his property, forced into prostitution and trapped in a world of violence and exploitation.
But he was a pimp. He forced her into prostitution. She didn't want to be a prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute. She was stuck in the middle of nowhere. Margo said to Bug, "It's time for me to go. I got to go." And he said, "You owe me $5,000. For rent, it's for food, it's for clothes for the girls, for school." And Buck Garrett said she was now property of the Hells Angels, and that if she came up with that amount of money, then he would let her go. She didn't have that kind of money, so Buck said, "I'm going to keep her kids until she came up with the money."
But Margo had done the unthinkable.
At that time, Margo knew a man by the name of Don Sessler, and he offered to help. So Don and Margo went to the local sheriff's office.
She'd talked, testified against Garrett and the Angels.
And so she agreed to testify against the Hells Angels, and specifically against Buck Garrett. And so the police did help her get her kids back.
In their world, it was the ultimate betrayal.
And there was gossip around town that there was a contract on her life now. I'm afraid that since I had gone to the police, Buck and his cronies were fine, and there would be some kind of punishment or retribution. Always in the back of my mind will have to be a day finally coming.
Snitches get stitches, or worse.
Margo had to do what she was doing. She felt it was the right thing to do. But we all knew that you just don't snitch on the Hells Angels. If you do, you're not going to live.
Much worse.
Anybody that testifies against the Hells Angels become targets. They've taken it upon themselves to make that decision cross that line. And the consequences are clear. So Margo was in beyond grave danger testifying against somebody like Garrett. Margo and Don Sessler got the twins. They fled to Laurelwood, Oregon.
But even in the brutal code of outlaw bikers, killing kids was crossing a line. Or was it? As Mike Graham pieced together Margo's story, he began to understand the magnitude of what he was up against. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a war, one that pitted law enforcement against an organization that operated by its own rules. The Hells Angels were more than just a motorcycle club. They were an empire built on drugs, violence, and a twisted sense of loyalty. Chapter 3. The Blue Wall meets chrome and leather. The Washington County Sheriff's Department was out of its depth, and Mike Graham knew it. They had no experience dealing with the Hells Angels. Hell, there weren't even any official chapters in Oregon.
There's no chapter of Hells Angels in the state of Oregon.
But evil knows no borders, and the tentacles of the organization reached far and wide. Determined to crack the case, Mike Graham reached out to detectives in California who had experience with the Angels.
I was out of my element. I was over my head. We don't even have Hells Angels in Oregon. So I flew to San Francisco, Palo, California, and teamed up with a couple of detectives from Solano County Sheriff's Office by the name of Dick Grundy and Bill Zerby.
Dick Grundy and Bill Zerby from the Solano County Sheriff's Office became invaluable allies. These men had put the Angels in their crosshairs years ago and they'd paid a heavy price for it.
They were narcotics guys who put the Angels in their crosshairs, and when Margo Compton was killed, they were dedicated to take down the Angels one by one.
Zerbe, in particular, had felt the wrath of the Angels. A car bomb had left him deaf, ending his career as a detective.
Detective Zerbe started putting more pressure on the Angels in general, and one day he was on his way to court. He went to get in his car. Apparently, they were watching him from a hill through binoculars. Apparently, they blew him up. Bill knew the Hells Angels were after him, and he lost his hearing, and he lost his job because of it.
But it hadn't diminished his resolve to bring the club to justice. As Mike Graham worked with these seasoned veterans, he began to understand the true nature of the beast he was up against.
I worked on the Compton homicide as best I could because it was starting to become a cold case, and there just wasn't much more evidence coming in.
Witnesses started disappearing.
As time went by, I developed some witnesses, but many of them seemed to die mysteriously. Doug Compton, the father of the twins, for example, died of pneumonia, allegedly, but the truth of the matter is, he developed the case of pneumonia after he was hit in the head with a hatchet.
Convenient accidents befell those who knew too much. The blue wall of law enforcement was up against the impenetrable brotherhood of leather and chrome. It was a clash of cultures, a battle of wills. Who would blink first? Chapter 4. The Prison Paradigm. As the investigation dragged on, Mike Graham's obsession grew. Sleepless nights turned into weeks, then months. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his dedication to the case.
I obsessed enough on it, thought about it enough that it was partially responsible for the divorce of my first wife. There was a time period when I was getting promoted, but for the most part I passed up promotions, because if I'd been promoted I would have been taken off the case.
But he couldn't let it go. The image of those little girls, teddy bears clutched in death's embrace, drove him forward.
So, this case, because it involved the two little girls that were about the same age as my own little daughter, cost me sleepless nights because I kept turning over what else could I do to figure out who did this murder.
Meanwhile, Buck Garrett's stint in prison wasn't going as planned. For law enforcement, that is.
When he got out, Buck Garrett started to cook meth and make a lot of money. He had started to climb up through the organization. Killing Margo Compton took away a really important threat, not just because she could testify firsthand about being raped and pimped, but the Vallejo chapter was where the Angels made their money off of the meth trade.
After Garrett's release, he started expanding his power base.
So after Margo was killed, Buck Garrett went on to huge success in the next several years. A ranch outside San Francisco, horses, and inside San Francisco, he was notorious. He was a kink man.
The Hells Angels controlled the streets, but in prison, the Aryan Brotherhood reigned supreme.
Outside of prison, methamphetamine was controlled by the Hells Angels. Inside of prison, that became the domain of the Aryan Brotherhood. Because the Hells Angels are a street-based motorcycle club, and the Aryan Brotherhood is a prison-based gang. And so, the Aryan Brotherhood controlled the prison.
It was a match made in criminal heaven. Garrett became a major supplier of methamphetamine within the prison system. His influence grew, extending beyond the walls of San Quentin. But with power came enemies, and not everyone was happy with Garrett's rise. Enter Michael Thompson, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood with a conscience, or at least a score to settle.
My information on Margo Compton came primarily from Buck Garrett and my discussions with him.
Thompson had information, dangerous information about the Compton murders.
He gives us information that matches the case pretty closely, but I also know that there's a lot of information out there in the news media, so I had withheld a little bit of evidence from the public. That one of the twins clutched in her fist a toy out of a Cracker Jack box, and Michael knew it. That's when I knew that Michael was telling me the truth.
He knew things about Bug-Eye Bob McClure, the alleged shooter.
I was in San Quentin with this guy, Bug-Eye Bob McClure, and Bug Garrett had told me that Bug-Eye Bob McClure was the shooter.
But why was he talking now, after all these years? What was his angle? As Thompson's testimony began to unravel the carefully constructed alibis and cover-ups, the dominoes started to fall.
This was a huge break in the case. I had a name now, and I was able to associate that name with Buck Garrett. Mike Thompson didn't particularly care for Buck Garrett. He didn't particularly care for Bug-Eye Bob McClure, the men who were capable of and did murder children. And so he decided to cooperate with law enforcement. And he did.
But in a world where loyalty is everything and snitches don't last long, how much of Thompson's story could be trusted? Chapter 5. The Trial of the Century. After years of dead ends and false starts, the case finally went to trial.
When we decided to go to trial, we prioritized the trial of Bug-Eye Bob McClure because he was the actual shooter. And we didn't know if we had enough to convict or not. And we were beginning to be concerned about maintaining the evidence we had.
Bug-Eye. Bob McClure, the man accused of pulling the trigger, was in the crosshairs of justice. But bringing him to court proved to be a logistical nightmare. Witnesses were in constant danger. Convicts in protected custody had to be moved with extreme caution.
These witnesses were convicts in protected custody. They could get killed.
At one point, an entire commercial flight was commandeered just to transport a single witness.
They flew me up there. They took over an entire commercial flight. Initially, I thought it was a little overdone, machine guns hanging off officers, and come to find out that their concerns were legitimate.
Bombs were found planted on vehicles meant to transport key players in the trial.
They had a series of cars that they convoyed me in, and they would switch up the cars. But they discovered that Hell's Angels had learned which car I was going to be in, and had planted a bomb on it.
In a scene straight out of a Hollywood thriller, Thompson had to be smuggled into the courthouse inside a hollowed-out vending machine.
They were looking for a way to safely get me into the courtroom. So they were going to have to hollow out a vending machine and put me inside of it and take me in that way. And that's what they did.
The lengths to which law enforcement had to go to ensure the safety of their witnesses spoke volumes about the power and reach of the Hells Angels. As the trial progressed, the full horror of the Compton murders came to light. Buck Garrett, brought in to testify, showed no remorse. His cold command to tell her to shut up when Margo's sister was on the stand sent chills through the courtroom.
During the trials, at one point, Buck Garrett stood up and said, "Tell her to shut up," while his attorney just stood there and watched me. So, was it remorse? No.
The jury listened, horrified, as the details of the execution-style murders were laid bare. The prosecution painted a picture of a ruthless organization that would stop at nothing to protect its interests, even if it meant gunning down innocent children. Chapter 6. The Aftermath and the Endless Road. The verdict came down like a thunderbolt, guilty. Justice, it seemed, had been served.
We watched the jury. Bonnie and I watched them as they came back with a guilty verdict. And the judge said, "This is the most egregious crime I've ever heard."
But in the world of outlaw bikers and career criminals, is justice ever truly final? For Bonnie and Lori, Margo's sisters, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but it couldn't bring back their loved ones. The ripples of that violent act in 1977 continued to spread, touching lives in ways that could never have been predicted. Mike Thompson, the unlikely hero, whose testimony had helped crack the case, found himself in a strange new world.
Mike is very thoughtful, and he's not just another guy. He's really special to me. I really feel like he's a hero.
A former Aryan Brotherhood member turned state's witness, he was now a man without a country, belonging neither to his old world nor fully accepted by his new one. As for Detective Mike Graham, the case had consumed a decade of his life. He had paid a heavy price for his dedication, but standing on the courthouse steps, he couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? The Hells Angels were wounded, but were they defeated? In this world of chrome and leather, where loyalty is prized above all else, could any victory ever be truly permanent? The story of the Compton murders and the subsequent investigation and trial became legend in law enforcement circles. It stood as a testament to the dedication of those who wear the badge, and a stark reminder of the dark underbelly of American society. But even as the dust settled on this case, new battles were brewing. The Hells Angels, bruised but not broken, continued to adapt and evolve. And somewhere out there, another detective was receiving a call, another crime scene was being discovered, another war was about to begin. In the end, the story of Margo Compton and the Hells Angels hitmen is more than just a true crime tale. It's a glimpse into a world most of us will never know. A world where the lines between right and wrong blur, where loyalty and betrayal dance a deadly tango, and where justice is never simple and rarely complete. The open road beckons, the engines rumble, and somewhere out there, the next chapter is waiting to be written. In the world of outlaw bikers and the law enforcement officers who pursue them, the ride never truly ends. It just changes direction.